Moments of national tension have a way of stripping away comfort and illusion. When headlines grow louder and tempers flare, it can feel as if everything familiar is suddenly unstable. Yet history suggests that these periods are not signs of sudden collapse, but moments of revelation. They expose how a society understands power, responsibility, and restraint. Democracy is not tested when things are easy. It is tested when patience feels costly, when emotions are high, and when outcomes are uncertain. In those moments, the true measure of a nation is not found in its slogans or promises, but in how it chooses to respond under pressure. It is tempting, during turbulent times, to believe that strength comes from dominance or defiance. Noise can feel like action, and outrage can feel like resolve. But democratic stability has never depended on volume. It depends on discipline. The loudest voices are not always the wisest, and the fastest decisions are not always the strongest. Democracies endure because they are built to slow things down when emotions speed up. That deliberate pacing is not weakness, it is protection. It creates space for reflection, disagreement, and correction before irreversible damage is done. Crises also challenge how people understand leadership. There is a natural instinct to search for individuals who promise certainty or decisive control. But nations are not held together by personalities. They are held together by principles that outlast any single figure. When too much faith is placed in individuals, institutions begin to fade into the background, and the system itself becomes fragile. History repeatedly shows that democracies survive not because leaders bend rules to save the system, but because they accept limits even when those limits are inconvenient. Restraint, in this sense, becomes a form of strength rather than surrender. Another illusion exposed during moments of stress is the idea that conflict itself is dangerous. In reality, disagreement is not a threat to democracy, it is evidence of it. Societies that allow debate, criticism, and protest are not unraveling, they are functioning. The danger arises when conflict is no longer guided by shared rules. Without agreed-upon boundaries, disagreement stops being productive and starts becoming destructive. That is why democratic systems rely so heavily on process. Process does not eliminate conflict, but it ensures that conflict leads somewhere other than chaos. At its core, this moment is not just about politics or policy. It is about character. It asks whether commitment to fairness and accountability survives when outcomes are uncomfortable. It asks whether patience can win over impulse, and whether long-term stability is valued over short-term satisfaction. Every generation inherits moments like this, moments when the future is shaped less by what happens and more by how people choose to respond. The decisions made now do not simply resolve a crisis, they define what kind of democracy remains afterward. And that raises the central question: when pressure is at its peak, what principle keeps a nation grounded instead of pulling it apart? At the center of every functioning democracy lies an understanding so familiar that it is often overlooked: no one stands above the law. This idea is not dramatic, and it does not command attention the way speeches or protests do. Yet it is the foundation that allows diverse societies to coexist without descending into constant conflict. The rule of law is not merely a set of written statutes. It is a collective agreement that power will be restrained, authority will be accountable, and justice will not bend to convenience or pressure. Without this shared commitment, laws become optional, institutions lose credibility, and citizenship turns into a contest of force rather than participation. The strength of the rule of law lies in its ability to turn disagreement into structure. In democratic systems, conflict is expected. People argue, compete, and challenge one another because they hold different values and priorities. The law does not eliminate these differences, nor is it meant to. Instead, it provides a framework in which disputes can be resolved without violence or intimidation. Courts interpret, legislatures debate, and executives enforce, not because they are flawless, but because no single actor is trusted with unchecked authority. This balance is intentional. It ensures that decisions emerge from process rather than impulse, and from legitimacy rather than raw power. In moments of crisis, the temptation to bypass legal restraint grows stronger. When outcomes feel urgent or emotions run high, rules can appear slow or inconvenient. That is precisely when the rule of law matters most. Following the law during calm periods is easy. Respecting it when it limits one's preferred outcome is far more difficult. Yet those moments of restraint send a powerful message. They affirm that leadership is not ownership, that authority is borrowed rather than possessed, and that power exists to serve the public, not to override it. When leaders submit to the law, even when it constrains them, they reinforce trust in the system itself. The rule of law also plays a crucial role in protecting dissent. Democracies depend on the ability of citizens to criticize those in power without fear of punishment. Legal protections ensure that opposition is not treated as betrayal and disagreement is not labeled disloyalty. This safeguard preserves the moral integrity of democratic societies. Power exercised without legal limits may appear decisive in the short term, but it corrodes confidence and invites instability. Power exercised within the law, even when controversial, builds legitimacy among both supporters and critics. It signals that outcomes may be contested, but the process remains fair. Ultimately, the rule of law is an act of collective faith. It is faith that written principles can guide human behavior, that institutions can correct themselves, and that no single moment justifies abandoning the foundations that hold a nation together. This faith does not require blind obedience or silence. It requires participation through lawful means, debate, protest, advocacy, and reform pursued within constitutional boundaries. When that faith is honored, democracy does more than survive turbulence, it proves its worth. But if laws are meant to restrain power, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who ensures those restraints are enforced when the pressure is greatest? Democratic institutions exist for a reason that is easy to forget in moments of urgency. They are not designed to move as fast as public emotion, nor are they meant to mirror the intensity of breaking news. Institutions are built to endure, not to react. Legislatures, courts, and constitutional processes slow decision-making on purpose, creating space between impulse and action. What may appear to some as delay or dysfunction is, in reality, a form of protection. By forcing debate, procedure, and accountability, institutions prevent power from concentrating too quickly or being exercised without reflection. Among these institutions, legislative bodies play a particularly important role. They are not extensions of any single leader's will, nor are they meant to operate as instruments of personal loyalty. Their authority comes from representation and responsibility to the broader public. When legislatures convene during tense periods, the goal is not spectacle or confrontation, but continuity. Formal sessions, investigations, and debates are mechanisms embedded in democratic systems to ensure that no moment, no matter how charged, escapes constitutional oversight. These processes reaffirm that authority flows through law rather than personality. This institutional role becomes most visible when public trust is strained. In polarized environments, legislative action is often mischaracterized as obstruction or partisan maneuvering. Yet the deeper function of these bodies is structural, not personal. By insisting on procedure, recorded votes, and open debate, institutions create transparency. Citizens may disagree with outcomes, but they can see how decisions are made. That visibility matters. Legitimacy in democracy does not require unanimity, it requires fairness and openness. When people can trace decisions back to established rules, even unpopular outcomes retain credibility. Institutions also serve as stabilizers in moments when executive power can move swiftly and decisively. Speed has its place, but unchecked speed carries risk. Legislatures are designed to slow momentum just enough to allow consequences to be examined and alternatives to be considered. This restraint is not inefficiency, it is intention. Democracies deliberately trade speed for deliberation because the cost of irreversible decisions is too high. In times labeled as emergencies, this cautious pace becomes even more important. Slowing power down is how systems protect themselves from overreach driven by fear, anger, or ambition. Perhaps most importantly, institutions remind both leaders and citizens that democratic authority is temporary. Representatives swear allegiance to constitutions, not to individuals. Their role is to uphold rules that apply regardless of who holds office. This principle reinforces the idea that leadership is conditional and accountable, not absolute. Institutions outlast personalities, crises, and political cycles because they are anchored in shared norms rather than personal loyalty. When they function as intended, they transform conflict into structured debate and channel national tension into lawful resolution instead of rupture. Yet when institutional conflict becomes visible, many mistake it for weakness. So how did the idea take hold that democracy itself is fragile rather than resilient? There is a common assumption that visible conflict is a sign of democratic failure. When disagreements dominate the public space and institutions appear strained, it is easy to conclude that the system itself is on the verge of collapse. Yet this belief misunderstands how democracy is designed to function. A fragile system shatters under pressure. A resilient one absorbs stress, adapts, and continues forward. Democracy was never intended to be quiet or effortless. It was built to manage disagreement without surrendering its core principles. The presence of tension does not signal weakness, it signals participation. Fear often grows when political conflict becomes visible and unavoidable. Sharp rhetoric, competing claims, and intense public debate can create the illusion that order is unraveling. But these moments are not abnormalities, they are features of open societies. Free systems invite disagreement because they protect expression and participation. When citizens argue, protest, and challenge authority, they demonstrate belief that their voices matter. In contrast, silence may indicate not unity, but suppression. Resilient democracies tolerate discomfort because they understand that controlled conflict is healthier than enforced calm. Democratic resilience depends heavily on institutions that provide peaceful channels for resolving disputes. Courts, legislatures, elections, and constitutional processes exist to prevent conflict from spilling into violence or coercion. These mechanisms do not promise perfect outcomes, but they do offer legitimate ones. Each time disputes are resolved through process rather than force, public confidence deepens. People learn that even deeply contested moments can be navigated without tearing the system apart. Over time, this repeated use of democratic channels creates a form of institutional memory, reinforcing expectations about how power is contested and transferred. Resilience also requires a cultural understanding of loss and disappointment. Democracy does not guarantee that every voice will prevail in every moment. What it guarantees is the opportunity to continue participating after defeat. When citizens accept that losing an argument or an election is not the end of engagement, the system gains durability. The willingness to remain involved despite frustration is one of the strongest indicators of democratic health. Societies fracture not because people disagree, but because they abandon shared rules when outcomes do not favor them. Narratives that portray democracy as constantly on the brink of collapse often serve a strategic purpose. Fear can be used to justify extreme actions in the name of preservation. History shows, however, that abandoning democratic norms out of panic does far more damage than disagreement ever could. True resilience is built through trust, trust in institutions, trust in process, and trust in fellow citizens to navigate conflict responsibly. Resilience is not passive endurance, it is active commitment. Still, resilience alone is not enough. Conflict must be handled carefully, so what prevents democratic disagreement from turning into chaos? When tensions rise, chaos often presents itself as action. It feels immediate, powerful, and emotionally satisfying. In moments of anger or fear, bypassing procedure can seem like the fastest way to restore control or deliver justice. But chaos offers only the illusion of strength. It replaces reason with impulse and legitimacy with force. Democratic systems were designed precisely to resist this temptation. Their insistence on process is not a bureaucratic obsession, it is a safeguard against decisions driven by emotion rather than consequence. Peaceful processes exist to channel conflict into outcomes that society can accept, even when those outcomes are imperfect. Elections, legislative deliberation, judicial review, and constitutional remedies provide structured ways to resolve disputes without resorting to intimidation or violence. These mechanisms slow events down, allowing facts to be examined and arguments to be weighed. Speed may satisfy outrage, but deliberation protects legitimacy. When decisions are made carefully rather than hastily, they are more likely to endure and less likely to provoke further instability. Chaos, by contrast, thrives on immediacy. It rewards escalation and frames compromise as weakness. While this approach may feel empowering in the short term, it erodes trust and creates uncertainty that harms everyone, especially the most vulnerable. Once norms are broken and force becomes acceptable, restoring order becomes far more difficult. Peaceful processes act as guardrails, keeping political struggle within boundaries that protect society as a whole. They prevent moments of crisis from becoming turning points toward permanent instability. Process also serves a critical role in protecting dissent. When people believe they still have lawful avenues to influence outcomes, they are less likely to resort to destructive behavior. Legal procedures ensure that opposition voices are heard rather than silenced, and that disagreement does not become grounds for punishment. In this way, process functions as a pressure valve. It allows frustration to be expressed through participation rather than confrontation. Democracies that preserve these channels reduce the risk that political conflict becomes personal, violent, or irreversible. There is a moral dimension to choosing process over chaos. Democracy is not only a system of governance, it is a statement about human dignity. It affirms that disputes should be resolved through dialogue and law because every person's rights matter. Chaos disregards that dignity, prioritizing dominance over deliberation. Over time, repeated reliance on lawful procedures builds institutional credibility. Each crisis navigated without abandoning process strengthens public confidence and reinforces democratic norms. And yet, when the pressure becomes unbearable and consequences feel historic, one final question remains. What do these choices reveal about a nation's true character? Moments of crisis do more than disrupt normal life. They strip away habit and comfort, revealing the values that truly guide a nation's behavior. When pressure mounts and uncertainty dominates, what matters most is not what a society claims to believe, but what it is willing to defend when doing so is difficult. Defining moments are not shaped by calm consensus but by contested choices made under stress. In these moments, democracy is not an abstract idea. It becomes a series of decisions that collectively determine whether principles are temporary or enduring. Such moments test whether commitments to fairness, accountability, and restraint survive when outcomes feel unacceptable to one side or another. Upholding democratic norms during comfort is easy. Doing so when frustration runs high requires integrity. A society's character is revealed in whether it chooses patience over panic and responsibility over revenge. Democracies weaken not because they face hard choices, but because they abandon their rules in pursuit of short-term relief. Strength, in this context, is not about winning at any cost, but about preserving the system that allows future participation. Crises also expose how power is understood and exercised. When authority is treated as entitlement, limits are viewed as obstacles. When power is seen as a responsibility, limits are respected even when they constrain desired outcomes. Leaders who honor boundaries during turbulent times reinforce the idea that no one owns democracy, it belongs to the people. Citizens who demand accountability rather than blind loyalty affirm the same truth. These interactions between leaders and the public shape democratic culture far more than any single event or decision. Defining moments carry lasting consequences because they educate future generations. People do not learn the meaning of democracy solely from textbooks or speeches. They learn from lived experience. When institutions hold firm and citizens engage responsibly during crises, younger generations internalize the belief that democracy is worth protecting. When norms are discarded for convenience, cynicism takes root. The examples set during times of strain echo long after the immediate conflict has passed, influencing how participation, trust, and disagreement are understood. There is also a broader significance beyond national borders. In an interconnected world, how a democracy responds to internal challenge sends signals outward. Responses grounded in law and restraint strengthen credibility and moral authority. Responses driven by chaos and impulse weaken both. Ultimately, defining moments demand a collective reckoning. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It survives only through shared commitment. Each choice to uphold process over impulse and principle over expediency becomes part of the foundation future generations will inherit. Because democracy does not fail in a single dramatic moment, it endures, or fades, through the choices made when it matters most.